Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Insta-angst, Trapped in the Maze of the Selfie. It only takes two facing mirrors to construct a labyrinth. Jorge Luis Borges. Why did I startle in my dream so that I awoke? Did not a child come to me carrying a mirror? O Zarathustra, said the child unto me, look at thyself in the mirror. But when I looked into the mirror, I shrieked, and my heart throbbed, for not myself did I see therein, but a devil's grimace and derision. Nietzsche, thus spake Zarathustra. And if you're looking for a devil's grimace, and you can't see my derision off screen, but this is what we're fighting against, people. The bovine, narcissistic, exhibitionist, vacuous, I'll just keep picking words out, but the idea that, you know, some of the greatest architecture in Western civilization can be used as the backdrop for these self-obsessed, probably artificially intelligence-enhanced, nauseously young, and at the threshold of life's possibilities. Sorry, I'll stop there. It's getting too personal. But to be serious for a second, the theme of today's talk will be taking that idea about vacuous reflections, vacuous images. And in English, of course, there's two senses to the word reflection. There's the image-based duplication of an image in a reflective surface, like a lake or a pond or a mirror. And increasingly in our society, endless screens that we're constantly inundated and immersed in. And then there's the sense of reflection in the deeper conceptual cerebral sense. The idea of stopping and pondering and reflecting upon. It's a more active, prepositional response to the world around us, which I'm going to argue throughout this talk, that's what art does. Art makes us stop and contemplate. And in our current social situation, we couldn't need more of it. It's just essential. And our society is driving out the type, ironically, the type of art that we need. So there'll be three major themes I'll be exploring today. The first one is the concept of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. And I'll be contrasting it with the second idea, the insta-angst, as a maze of mirrors. So you've got a labyrinth and the Minotaur. You've got this dark myth. And opposed to that, you've got this idea of a maze of mirrors. And I mentioned before, the edifying reflections is the role of art. But what you may not be more familiar with, most people have heard of the myth of the Minotaur, Knossos, King Minos. And I encourage you to go and, it just takes too long. The irony is, to actually give a full account of the myth of the Minotaur, it's labyrinthine, the narrative, as you begin to describe it. There's layer upon layer upon layer. So, for example, when Theseus goes to see his father that he's never met, his real biological father, that the phrase the poison chalice is his stepmother tries to poison him initially until the father realizes that it's his long lost son. But the notion of the poison chalice comes from that story. Later, Theseus betrays Ariadne, and there's, depending on the version of the myth, there's different explanations. Was it betrayal, or did the god Dionysus come to him in a dream and persuade him to abandon Ariadne? And there's, you know, Ariadne put the thread in the maze so that Theseus, after he slayed the Minotaur, could escape. So there's, within the story itself, there's layer upon layer upon layer. And I'm opposing that with this idea of insta-angst. We're constantly anxious because we're in a maze of mirrors that just, instead of edifying reflections, all we get back reflected back to us are vacuous, empty signs that contrasts with proper literature and with ancient myths. There's significant symbolic layers that we're now lacking in our society. And I'm going to lead up to the conclusion is this concept of the odyssey of life. So I mentioned in the last video, the existential psychotherapy video, I looked at Primo Levi's haunting memoir of Auschwitz, If This Is a Man. And in it, there's, I think, chapter 11. It's called The Canto of Ulysses. And Ulysses is the Latinized version of Odysseus, the Greek Homeric epic. And the odyssey of life, I'm going to suggest at the end that this notion of an odyssey, going out on the metaphorical open sea to find out what you can about life, to explore reason, to explore not just reason, but art as well. And in some ways, it's the opposite of remaining stuck in this maze of mirrors. So to explore, firstly, this notion of the labyrinth of the Minotaur, to show how far back in human culture it goes. Here is a painting of a bull. I think they're called the aurochs. It's like an extinct form of bull now. But this is from Le Sceaux in France, and if you think, I encourage you to go and do your own research on the cave paintings, but the scholars I've read suggest that it's probably a popular misconception that the cave people just painted what they were then going to go out and hunt. So it was almost like a form of prayer or wish fulfillment. Rather, there's evidence to suggest that as they went deeper and deeper into the original labyrinths into these big cave systems, you imagine how incredibly limited their light sources were. So they're disorientated. They've done this voluntarily, but you're disorientated in terms of space. There's a lack of light. They found evidence that they used hollowed out or altered bones or pieces of wood that they'd tie on the end of twine or animal skin, and they'd wave it above their heads to get a thrumming sound through the air. So that added a rhythmic sound. So there's a lack of light. You're spatially disorientated. There's a thrumming sound. We don't know whether they took hallucinogens, but the idea is that perhaps they were seeking altered states of consciousness, and these are the type of images that came into their heads that they wanted to express themselves. So it just shows you that this is Paleolithic man. It's some of the first human expression occurred in a labyrinth, and it had a bull as its origin. So that's in terms of artistic expression. And then you may be less familiar with this, the idea that the Aleph, the first letter of Western texts, this is the evolution of it from ancient Egyptian through the Phoenician. You see it becomes more of a modern type of letter on its side, and then the Greeks turned it around so the horns became the feet, so to speak. So not only was the bull the beginning of, human beings' exploration of their own unconscious images, it's also the beginning of our more reflective modes of communication in terms of writing. And then if I can show you, this is a painting, The Minotaur, by George Frederick Watts from 1885. And then I'll read from a short story, not all of it, but probably about 50% of it, The House of Asterion, La Casa de Asterion, by Jorge Luis Borges. And just to give you some background, this was painted by Judge Frederick Watts as a response to, I think it was the Pall Mall Gazette. Apparently he'd read an article the day before in the London press about the dark underside. You know, so talk about a labyrinth, but the dark, seamy underside of Victorian London. And an investigative journalist bought a 13-year-old girl from her own parents for the matter of a measly few pounds. And he was so upset and outraged by this that he painted it, made him, it led him, it provided the inspiration for this work of art. And if I can just show you one thing to focus on, it's just the, not random, but just like careless cruelty. There's a bird clutched in the Minotaur's fist. You know, just a casual reference to the cruelty involved. And then if I can just pick out, if you can see just halfway down on the left at the outer edge of the painting, the little white mark, that's the sail of the ship coming towards the Minotaur. And it varies in the different forms of the myth. The numbers vary, but I think the most common recounting of the myth says there were 7 adolescent boys and 7 adolescent girls every, I think it was 7 or 9 years, depending on the version, were brought to the Minotaur, who they would sacrifice to him. And you can see the wall that the Minotaur is behind in quite an economical way. Watts, as the artist, has shown, conveyed the sense of how circumscribed and entrapped in the maze, despite the fact he's looking out to open sea. He's definitely within the walls of this structure. And I again, sorry to repeat myself, but please do go and do some research, because the guy who designed the maze within which the Minotaur is kept was Daedalus, and he was the father of Icarus, the guy who flew too close to the sun. And Daedalus was the guy who created this wooden, huge imitation female cow because she wanted to be impregnated by the bull that Poseidon had given to her husband Minos. And Minos, rather than sacrifice the bull to Poseidon, kept it. So Poseidon's revenge was to get his wife Pasiphae. And this is, again, I'm giving you details, but forgive me, but it's layers within layers within layers. And that's what makes Greek mythology labyrinthine, but arguably labyrinthine in a good way. Because it's not pointless, it's all context, it's all additional information, it's all to show how human life is inextricably linked in various complex ways. People's motivations, people's desires have subsequent effects, an unforeseen fate, and all these issues going on. But while you look at that, if you'll be patient with me, I just find this quite a haunting rendition. This is Borges's interpretation of the Minotaur, which I think is slightly unusual. It's a bit more sympathetic than you might expect. So I'm not giving you the whole thing, but this is about half of it. I'm giving you various excerpts that I hope go together quite well. So this is how it, I'll start the excerpt. The fact is, I am unique. I am not interested in what a man can publish abroad to other men. Like the philosopher, I think that nothing can be communicated by the art of writing. Vexatious and trivial minutiae find no refuge in my spirit, which has been formed for greatness. I have never grasped for long the difference between one letter and another. A certain generous impatience has prevented me from learning to read. Sometimes I regret that because the nights and the days are long. Of course, I do not lack for distractions. Sometimes I run like a charging ram through the halls of stone until I tumble dizzily to the ground. Sometimes I crouch in the shadow of a wellhead or at a corner in one of the corridors and pretend I'm being hunted. There are rooftops from which I can hurl myself until I am bloody. I can pretend any time I like that I am asleep and lie with my eyes closed and my breathing heavy. Sometimes I actually fall asleep. Sometimes by the time I open my eyes, the colour of the day has changed. But of all the games, the one I like best is pretending that there is another Asterion. I pretend that he has come to visit me, and I show him round the house. Bowing majestically, I say to him, "Now let us return to our previous intersection," or "Let us go this way, now, out into another courtyard," or "I knew that you would like this rain gutter," or "Now you will see a cistern that is filled with sand," or "Now you'll see how the cellar forks." Sometimes I make a mistake, and the two of us have a good laugh over it. Every 9 years, 9 men come into the house so that I can free them from all evil. I hear their footsteps or their voices far away in the galleries of stone, and I run joyously to find them. The ceremony lasts but a few minutes. One after another, they fall, without my ever having to bloody my hands. Where they fall, they remain, and their bodies help distinguish one gallery from the others. I do not know how many there have been, but I do know that one of them predicted as he died that someday my Redeemer would come. Since then, there has been no pain for me in solitude, because I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will rise and stand above the dust. If my ear could hear every sound in the world, I would hear his footsteps. I hope he takes me to a place with fewer galleries and fewer doors. What will my Redeemer be like, I wonder? Will he be bull or man? Could he possibly be a bull with the face of a man, or will he be like me? The morning sun shimmered on the bronze sword. Now there was not a trace of blood left on it. "Can you believe it, Ariadne?" said Theseus. The Minotaur scarcely defended itself. So I maybe return to that at another time, but there's so much, potentially in there, but we need to move on. But I hope you can see some of the parallels with, and perhaps Borges is having a joke because the Minotaur is saying he doesn't know the difference between one letter and another, which is ironic, given that he's the bull is the basis of, as I showed you, the letter A, the impetus, the inspiration for the letter A. But throughout the story, as Borges presents it, there's a ennui, there's a boredom, because he doesn't read, because he has a limited imagination and he has to create his own, interactions with an imaginary friend like a child would. It makes him incredibly susceptible to his eventual murder, which he almost welcomes by Theseus, which is the twist at the end. Theseus just comes to kill him, and the Minotaur hardly fights. He's very vulnerable. But I think there's metaphors there, or allegories for the notion that in today's society, where people lack meaning, where they lack the ability to read extensively, it makes them vulnerable to false redeemers, to people basically snake oil salesmen. And whatever your politics, I think you could probably see evidence of that in the world around us, the whole online culture. But anyway, so that's Borges, and what I said at the beginning was I wanted to show you how the way in which art, rather than just passively reflect things, it encourages you to contemplate, it encourages you to reflect in the cerebral sense. So here are some examples from art that engage with this notion of the dark heart of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. So Picasso, for example, was obsessed with the notion of the Minotaur. And there's the 4th volume. It was never finished. There was a biography, one particular biography. I think Richards was the surname. Forgive me if I got that wrong. But the 4th volume that goes up to 1943, I think. So it ends when there's still 30 years of Picasso's life to go. But that's called, the title he gave the volume is The Minotaur Years. And it's, like I said, it's a repeated theme throughout Picasso's career. This is perhaps the most famous Minotaur themed. And I'll have to do a future video because I'll get distracted. There's far too much depth and you could talk about this for hours. And this is the title in French. It's The Wounded Minotaur. And then just in case you didn't believe me, this is Picasso having fun in his studio. But he really did take the notion that he himself was a Minotaur relatively seriously. But I just thought, this is also by Borges, from a collection called it From In Praise of Darkness. But this is a very short poem just called The Labyrinth, which gives another perspective that I hope you might find quite interesting. So it begins, this is The Labyrinth by Borges. Zeus himself could not undo the web of stone closing around me. I have forgotten the men I was before. I follow the hated path of monotonous walls that is my destiny. Severe galleries which curve in secret circles to the end of the years. Parapets cracked by the day's usury. In the pale dust I have discerned signs that frighten me. In the concave evenings, the air has carried a roar toward me, or the echo of a desolate howl. I know there is another in the shadows, whose fate it is to wear out the long solitudes which weave and unweave this Hades, and to long for my blood and devour my death. Each of us seeks the other. If only this were the final day of waiting. So again, it's obviously quite dark, but what I find fascinating about these accounts or recounting of the Minotaur myth by Borges is that is from a different perspective. That is, the human victim is beginning to wish to embrace his own end just to get the waiting over with. Whereas in the previous example, it was the Minotaur. So Borges gives you both sides. But obviously there are metaphors inherent in this about life in general and the waiting for our eventual fate. So in terms of exploring the labyrinth, Richard Rorty, he did this brilliant book for Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, and in it he distinguishes between systematic and edifying philosophies. So the way he describes it, Systematic philosophies are fundamentally based upon explanation, the how. So systematic philosophies are largely dominant science today. The way in which a lot of journalism tries to use statistics and reports things in a mode that journalism itself believes that there is some type of objective truth it is trying to capture. So the explanation, the how. And Rorty contrasts this with, whilst edifying philosophies are much more concerned with justifications, the why. And in the previous video on existential psychotherapy, I cited Viktor Frankl, quoting Nietzsche. So again, another labyrinth of references, but basically saying that a man can survive any amount of how if only he has a why. And the previous accounts of the Minotaur are by Borges are implying there's a lack of a why. So when there's a lack of a why, when there's a lack of meaning, which is my constant theme, I think it's modern contemporary society lacks adequate meaning. And I'd suggest that that's largely because we've lost edifying philosophies and they've been predominantly replaced by systematic philosophies. This is all in Rorty's terms. So Rorty, this is again, says, great systematic philosophers are constructive and offer arguments. Great edifying philosophers are reactive and offer satires, parodies, and aphorisms. So in what I'm about to show you, I'm going to give you various additional illustrations from art. And what I'm asking you to think about is the way in which these reactive in common parlance tends to be quite a negative normally association. Oh, you're just reacting. But arguably some of the most harmful great systems of thinking, Maoism, Stalinism, these have been great constructive projects, systematic philosophies. Whereas I am strongly of Rorty's opinion that you need great edifying philosophers, i.e. artists, who can react to situations with satire, parodies, and aphorisms. And I always try and avoid politics on this channel wherever possible, but I've just noticed, without naming a certain, I think, Californian politician who's trying basically to outlaw satire on the internet. But these are the times we live in, that satire itself, I don't think it will work what he's trying to do, but the idea that it's even being tried at all. And in the UK, where I am, the extent to which speech in public is increasingly being policed. So it's only probably a matter of time before, you know, satire and parody, you've got to be very careful what you say. So if you hear the door being knocked through, it's the thought police have come to get me. But I'm joking, but it's getting worse and worse. But anyway, risk going off on a free speech riff. This is a excerpt, and it's called The Exactitude of Science in English. I'm trying to remember, I think in Spanish it's Del rigor en la ciencia, which just means of the rigor in science. And it's on another video, I'm going to most probably discuss the act of translation itself, because it's an absolute minefield. So, for example, I just don't know why they decided to, the translators called it the exactitude of science. But I'm going to show you the whole, he's a master of brevity, Borges, unlike me. But I'll give you, it's basically a paragraph. If you can have a short story in a paragraph, I'm about to show you the whole of this short story. And it encapsulates so much meaning. And without wanting to steer you, but it's quite obvious that the relevance of this story for our present times requires you, as I'm reading it, to think of the story turned on its head. So the story as it's written doesn't quite describe what's going on today, but if you actually invert the story's meaning, then it's a brilliant description of the situation we find ourselves in, and it'll become clearer as I read it to you. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers' Guild struck a map of the empire, whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. And that, if you could call it a short story, that's the whole of it. It's referenced in this brilliant book by Jean Baudrillard, Simulations. And this book, Simulations, was used as a visual pun in the Wachowski brothers' Matrix film, where a hollowed out copy of Simulations is where Neo keeps one of his storage devices. But this is Baudrillard's take. If we were to revive the fable today, it would be the territory whose shreds are slowly rotting across the map. It is the real and not the map, whose vestiges subsist here and there in the deserts, which are no longer those of the empire, but our own. The desert of the real itself. But it is no longer a question of either maps or territory. Something has disappeared, the sovereign difference between them that was the abstraction's charm. So think that the desert of the real itself, isn't that a line from the Matrix? Welcome to the desert of the real. So this is Baudrillard's take, and it reinforces, it reinforces what I was saying about if you have to turn the story on its head. In Borges' story, the map is what frays away. It's a one-for-one. It's an exact copy of the empire. But people lose interest in cartography and the map frays. It wastes away. But what Baudrillard's claiming is, in our society, reality itself is what is frayed, and we're living in the simulation. We're living in the representation of reality. And just look around you, the number of times I walk around the countryside and people are looking into mobile phones whilst walking in the countryside. It's the invasiveness of so-called social media, even when you should be in the moment of being out in the great outdoors. And the way in which, if you think about it, even something as benign often as GPS, basically the whole of human reality now is mapped and digitally available. There are no true empty spaces anymore that aren't GPS mapped in that sense. But the idea that the sovereign difference between them, in other words, the sovereign difference between representations, maps, and the territory, that was the abstraction's charm. And I'm arguing that the abstraction's charm only still exists in such a media-saturated world in the realm of art. Art celebrates the difference between reality and its representation. The rest of our contemporary technologized life is all about the confusion, the way in which reality is replaced by uncritical, unreflective, unartistic abstraction. So rather than Witter, I'll give you some examples. So René Magritte's, the way in which he plays with your idea of what to expect from a mirror. So in a world of endless reproduction, he's showing you that something that shouldn't work. You know, obviously visually, that's not, the man would not see the back of himself in the mirror. So immediately he's making you think about the process of duplication. Likewise in this, the concept of, you know, the eyes being the mirror of the souls, except this isn't a mirror. This implies there's immense space and ambiguity inside the head of the person whose eye that represents. Another, just playing, you know, you think initially perhaps that it's a window onto a beautiful sea scene, a calm, placid sea and clouds, but actually the cupboard opens. So what is actually being reflected and what's in the darkness beyond? Do, do, do. And then I want to show you a few, just 2 or 3 Monets to show you the way in which Monet became obsessed with reflection on water. But this is a form of duplication, the reflection of reality back in the water and the reflection of the sky in the water. That as Monet progressed, everything became much more merged together, which again should make you think, as you contemplate this, the whole act of duplication, rather than just passively receive a duplicated image. So he did a series of paintings about weeping willows. And I'm trying to illustrate my point in which increasingly with Monet it just becomes one big, beautiful, artistic mishmash, if that's not a very clumsy way of describing the beauty of Monet. But it's almost like an imbroglio of everything merging together. You know, the reflection takes on almost a substantial element rather than just being reflection on water. And then in the water lilies, there's foliage above being reflected in the water. And there's sky being reflected in the water. And again, and if you see these in the original, in their setting, is it L'Orangerie in Paris, the gallery? And it's like drowning the actual physical sensation, being surrounded by this ellipse of these water lily paintings. And then just to show you, I'm not always wedded to the past. This is a contemporary artist, female Japanese artist, Yayoi Kusama. And she uses, typically, it's common in her work, she uses light, mirrors, and water all together to create this sense of exponential infinity. And quite a dramatic title, Aftermath of Obliteration of Eternity. But I'm claiming that art like this at least makes you question the endless repetition or the endless duplication. You could almost envisage this as a representation of, this almost looks like it could be from the film The Matrix. This endless receding representations of digital bits and bytes. So back to Dante's Inferno. So this is Canto or section 26. And what I want to do, I'm not just showing you, I'm going to show you the text, the relevant, it's not the whole of Canto 26, but the relevant text. And the reason is, this section of the canto is what Primo Levi refers to in his book. So I'm going to conclude the talk after I've shown you this as background, so you'll be familiar with what Primo Levi is referring to. I'll then read you the section from If This Is a Man, where he directly engages with Dante's Inferno. And why I'm doing that is, to repeat what I said at the beginning of the talk, I want to try and convey, so I'd ask you, it's all, for me, and this is what I'm interested in what you think, but for me, it's almost inconceivable that if there was something as horrible as the death camps ever happened again, it begs the question, where are people going to get the meaning that would sustain them through that type of experience or something similar? And I just do not think it's a coincidence. Correlation is not causation, as I always emphasize. But the recorded levels of mental illness and mental anguish and young people suffering, and the concomitant lack of engagement with literature and the increasing loss of contact with the great classics, it does beg the question. And when I gave the examples of the Minotaur and Borges' interpretation that part of the tragedy was he lacked the meaning provided for by literacy. So it sounds, and I'm just convinced it must sound like a stretch, that something like Dante's Divine Comedy in this section, the Inferno, could be that important. But I'll just say it for the last time, in the crucible, the actual inferno of human depravity, it's what kept Primo Levi going. And in the section I'm about to read you, the background information that you might be vaguely helpful is Penelope is mentioned. She's the wife of Ulysses. Ulysses is basically, he's trapped in hell in a flame. So that's how the excerpt begins. I think it talks about the higher horn, meaning there's this two-horned flame, one of whom is Diomedes and the other is Ulysses. They're trapped together. They were opponents in the Trojan War, and they're trapped in the Inferno. And Virgil and Dante are talking to the flame that contains their souls, and Ulysses is speaking from the flame. So Ulysses describes how he went on his final voyage, and the sense of it is that Ulysses is arguing that he had this urge to explore. So there's an obvious resonance with the human search for knowledge versus, remember, this is in contrast to someone like, or some creature like the Minotaur, trapped in a labyrinth of non-meaning. Then of that age-old fire, the loftier horn began to mutter and move as a waving flame wrestles against the wind and is overworn. And like a speaking tongue, vibrant to frame language, the tip of it flickering to and fro, threw out a voice and answered, "When I came from Circe at last, who would not let me go, but 12 months near, Caeta hindered me, before Aeneas ever named it so. No tenderness for my son, nor piety to my old father, nor the wedded love that should have comforted Penelope, could conquer in me the restless itch to rove and rummage through the world, exploring it, all human worth and wickedness to prove. So on the deep and open sea I set forth with a single ship and that small band of comrades that had never left me yet. Far as Morocco, far as Spain I scanned both shores. I saw the island of the Sardi and all that sea and every wave-girt land. I and my fellows were grown old and tardy, or ere we made the straits where Hercules set up his marks, that none should prove so hardy to venture the uncharted distances. Suitor I'd left to larboard, sailing by. Seville I now left in the starboard seas. Brothers, said I, that have come valiantly through 100,000 jeopardies, undergone to reach the west, you will not now deny to this last little vigil left to run of feeling life, the new experience of the uninhabited world behind the sun. Think of your breed, for brutish ignorance your metal was not made. You were made men to follow after knowledge and excellence. My little speech made everyone so keen to forge ahead that even if I'd tried, I hardly think I could have held them in. So with our poop shouldering the dawn, we plied, making our oars wings to the witless flight and steadily gaining on the larboard side. Already the other pole was up by night with all its stars, and ours had sunk so low, it rose no more from the ocean floor to sight. 5 times we had seen the light kindle and grow beneath the moon, and 5 times wane away. Since to the deep we had set course to go, when at long last hove up a mountain, grey with distance, and so lofty and so steep, I never had seen the like on any day. Then we rejoiced, but soon we had to weep, for out of the unknown land there blew foul weather, and a whirlwind struck the forepart of the ship. And 3 times round she went in a roaring smother with all the waters. At the 4th the poop rose and the prow went down, as pleased another. And over our heads the hollow seas closed up. So I wanted to give you that background because what I'm going to read you now is this chapter 11, the Canto of Ulysses, from If This Was a Man by Primo Levi. And there'll be some paintings from Jean Fautria that I've used before, but I'm just absolutely smitten by them. And towards the, I think there's a French phrase where he's talking to his friend Jean, who's also known by the nickname Piccolo, which just means messenger boy, was the name given in the camps. So that was the role of one of the inmates. So he's gone on an expedition to get soup to bring it back to the kitchen. And Jean, the guy known as Piccolo, the nickname, got Primo to go with him as a favour because they have to walk quite a distance, and it means that they're just for that short period of time they're free from all the worries of the camp. They just have time to go and get the soup and bring it back on these poles they carry on their shoulder. So Piccolo says at one point in French, it's words to the effect of, I'll read it out later, but it's don't worry, just carry on. So when you hear some French, that's what that means. And at the very end, it's cabbages and turnips is the soup that's being made. And it's referred to in German, French, and Hungarian. So there'll be the foreign phrases that you're hearing. And I think the Fautria paintings just summarize in a horrible way the way in which it was from a series called Otage, Hostages. And they just remind me the heads that Fautria has painted. I just think they match this concept of cabbages and turnips. And then it was interesting that Fautria spent time in London and said he was hugely influenced by Turner. and I keep saying this, but I will. I'm going to do at least one video on Turner's paintings. But he was influenced by Turner. It might sound odd because the paintings are so dissimilar. But Fautrier said he was influenced by Turner's use of colour. So I'll end the whole thing just with a Turner painting that will match the idea of the whole sea rising up above Ulysses and his crew to extinguish them. So this is the text from Levy's chapter 11, not all of it, just excerpts that hopefully run together well. The canto of Ulysses. Who knows how or why it comes into my mind? But we have no time to change. This hour is already less than an hour. If Jean is intelligent, he will understand. He will understand. Today I feel capable of so much. Who is Dante? What is the comedy? That curious sensation of novelty which one feels if one tries to explain briefly what is the Divine Comedy, how the Inferno is divided up, what are its punishments. Virgil is reason, Beatrice is theology. Jean pays great attention, and I begin slowly and accurately. Then of that age-old fire the loftier horn began to mutter and move as a wavering flame wrestles against the wind and is overworn. And, like a speaking tongue vibrant to frame language, the tip of it, nickering to and fro, threw out a voice and answered, "When I came." Here I stop and try and translate. Disastrous, poor Dante and poor French. All the same, the experience seems to promise well. Jean admires the bizarre simile of the tongue and suggests the appropriate word to translate, age-old. And after, when I came, nothing, a hole in my memory. Before Aeneas ever named it so, another hole. A fragment floats into my mind, not relevant. Nor piety to my old father, not the wedded love that should have comforted Penelope. Is it correct? So on the open sea I set forth. Of this I am certain, I am sure. I can explain it to Piccolo. I can point out why I set forth is not je me mis. It is much stronger and more audacious. It is a chain which has been broken. It is throwing oneself on the other side of a barrier. We know the impulse well. The open sea. Piccolo has travelled by sea and knows what it means. It is when the horizon closes in on itself, free, straight ahead and simple, and there is nothing but the smell of the sea, sweet things, ferociously far away. We have arrived at Kraftwerk, where the cable-laying commando works. Engineer Levy must be here. Here he is. One can only see his head above the trench. He waves to me. He is a brave man. I have never seen his morale low. He never speaks of eating. Open sea, open sea. I know it rhymes with left me. And that small band of comrades that had never left me. But I cannot remember if it comes before or after. And the journey as well, the foolhardy journey beyond the Pillars of Hercules. How sad I have to tell it in prose, a sacrilege. I have only rescued 2 lines, but they are worth stopping for. That none should prove so hardy to venture the uncharted distances. To venture. I had come to the lager to realise that it is the same expression as before. I set forth. But I say nothing to Jean. I am not sure that it is an important observation. How many things there are to say, and the sun is already high. Midday is near. I am in a hurry, a terrible hurry. Here, listen, Piccolo. Open your ears and your mind. You have to understand for my sake. Think of your breed, for brutish ignorance your metal was not made. You were made men, to follow after knowledge and excellence. As if I also was hearing it for the first time, like the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am. Piccolo begs me to repeat it. How good Piccolo is. He is aware that it is doing me good. Or perhaps it is something more. Perhaps the wan translation and the pedestrian rushed commentary. He has received the message. He has felt that it has to do with him, that it has to do with all men who toil, and with us in particular, and that it has to do with us too, who dare to reason of these things with the poles for the soup on our shoulders. My little speech made everyone so keen, and I try but in vain to explain how many things this keen means. There is another lacuna here, this time irreparable. The light kindles and grows beneath the moon, or something like it. But before it, not an idea. Keine Ahnung, as they say here. Forgive me, Piccolo, I have forgotten at least 4 triplets. Ça ne fait rien. Va-tu de même? When at last hove up a mountain grey with distance, and so lofty and so steep, I had never seen the like on any day. Yes, yes, so lofty and so steep. Not very steep, a consecutive proposition. And the mountains, when one sees them in the distance, the mountains. Oh, Piccolo, Piccolo, say something, speak. Do not let me think of my mountains which used to show up against the dusk as evening as I returned by train from Milan to Turin. Enough, one must go on. These are things that one thinks but does not say. Piccolo waits and looks at me. I would give today's soup to know how to connect the like on any day to the last lines. I try to reconstruct it through the rhymes. I close my eyes. I bite my fingers. But it's no use. The rest is silence. Other verses dance in my head. The sodden ground belched wind. No, it's something else. It's late. It's late. We have reached the kitchen. I must finish. And 3 times round she went in roaring smother, with all the waters. At the 4th the poop rose and the prow went down, as pleased another. I keep Piccolo back. It's vitally necessary and urgent that he listen, that he understand this as pleased another, before it is too late. Tomorrow here I might be dead, or we might never see each other again. I must tell him, I must explain to him about the Middle Ages, about the so human and so necessary and yet unexpected anachronism, but still more, something gigantic that I myself have only just seen, in a flash of intuition, perhaps the reason for our fate, for our being here today. We are now in the soup queue, among the sordid, ragged crowd of soup carriers from other commandos. Those just arrived press against our backs. Kraut und Rüben, Kraut und Rüben. The official announcement is made that the soup today is of cabbages and turnips. Chou à neve, kaposta esgrapak. And over our heads, the hollow seas closed up.